last time I told you all about various cultural values, how we assess cross-cultural psych, and this time we are talking about the origins of cultural differences. This has a very evolutionary psychology bent, often, and we all know how my opinions are on cross-culture or on evolutionary psych. It has some good ideas, but it tends to get painted as here's obviously how this came to pass, as opposed to how I view evolutionary psych is that here is one possible alternative that's plausible and cannot be eliminated at this time. Those are the two ways to think about it. Boom. Okay, so why are cultures different? Why? What determines the specific distinctive psychology that a culture develops? Why am I collectivist for the more, bicultural, but why am I a mix? How did that happen? How did that even transmit to me? Well, my dad's side, we've got farmers who are, you can trace them back to pilgrims, and my mom's side, we are refugees who fled Eastern Europe and avoided the camps. So I'm very grateful we fled. And you should be too, because otherwise you would not be watching this fabulous video. So how did that happen? Yeah. I mean, everybody can kind of come up with a narrative for themselves, but how did those values get transmitted over time? And so one approach is deconstructionism. And essentially it's avoiding the issue. And here's the stance. That reality has no meaning apart from what humans invent or construct. It views these questions as unanswerable. And honestly, this is not a useful approach. While we can be skeptical, I think it's worth trying to understand how these came about. Alright. Oh, and before I go further, I want to highlight that this is not a genetic thing. As much as I love being a behavior geneticist and saying, oh, look, there's heritable, this is not heritable. It is not. Okay. So, origins of cultural differences. So, the old school ecological approach is this. Views that differences exist because different cultures developed in different circumstances. So, both of these are very environmental approaches. Where the needs to, initially environmental approaches, which is totally fair. Where different cultures developed in different circumstances with the needs to deal with different problems. And so the old model was ecology leads to culture, which leads to socialization, which leads to personality, which leads to behavior. And so I'm going to go through some definitions here, just so we can keep rolling. So ecology, we're talking the physical layout and resources of the land, and the distinct tasks and challenges this culture had to face. For example, here are the book illustrations. They make me cringe a little, but I'm going to share them so you can share in my cringe. Okay, so the need for complex agricultural projects and water systems in China required coordination, and that results in collectivism. Versus in Germany, the need for hunting, which required more individual effort and resulted in individualism. Germany's Germany is a very new country. If we look at the Germanic people, I really feel like the contrast here is problematic. I have much more of a problem with the hunting in Germany example. Because, what counts as Germany? It's very broad. Are we talking the Black Forest and most hunting requires coordinated effort. let's see if we can capture the chaos. We got one cat being suspicious. Okay. But I'm going to go through these examples, and that's the argument. That Germany was full of hunters that had to hunt on their own and resulted in individualism. Okay, so, yeah. So, other examples include levels of infectious disease based on living in, quote, clean or dirty environments. So, higher disease was associated with lower extroversion and openness. Okay, so here's another one. I'm going to go through all these examples. Oh, so actually, let's back up a little, because these examples are pretty overwhelming. And so, but here's the idea is in both of these that ecology plays a role. In the old model, we had ecology leads to culture, which in turn leads to socialization, which in turn leads to personality, like a very linear approach. But in fact, it's interactive. The newer model is that culture and ecology play together, mind and ecology and mind play together, all of them. But let's go back to the evolutionary psychology approaches to origins of cultural differences. Alright, so here's another one. Need to catch fish in open water, which is dangerous, is related to men with high bravery and more propensity to violence, as well as domination over women. Alright. So, and the idea, so that's open water. Now versus ability to catch fish in protected waters is related to men who are gentle, ignore insults, and are respectful to women. Now, I do have a comment here about these are only speculations. Yeah. But I just want to highlight that most of these have the same problems that evolutionary psych does. How do we test them? For the most part, we can't. The counterfactuals don't exist, or when we do come, like the counterfactual really doesn't feel right. So, like, there's great narrative about early agriculture in China, but you kind of have to come up with what else? What would be the flip? So, reduced agriculture, and so then you go and find an example of like hunting in the Black Forest of Germany. That's why they're individualistic. Those are, so, yeah, okay, so my other last little definition, because we're not going to define personality again, even though it's a consistent pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So socialization is a big piece here, where explicit and implicit teaching during childhood kind of perpetuates, so these are often categorized as environmental effects, and I wouldn't disagree with it, like from a behavior genetic standpoint. But that's the idea. Cool. Cultural differences from genetics. This is often a typical assumption that like non-psychologists will make, and even some psychologists. But realistically, most of these differences are learned, not innate. There are some select examples where, like, but they're honestly more like changes in, like food, like, I'm trying to figure out how do I articulate this example. So, being allergic to milk. That, being able to process milk is pretty rare, but it only seems to come up being lactose intolerant. That is the word I was looking for that I could not find. Lactose intolerance is pretty much the norm everywhere, except for cultures that had dairy-based agriculture, had cows. So pretty much Europeans, for the most part. And so they developed a tolerance for lactose over time. And so there are genetic differences. 99% of everybody, our DNA is the same. And the last 1%, about half of it differs between cultures, and half of it differs within culture. They're tiny. So the genetic differences are small. Traits are very likely to be weak predictors of behavior at the cultural level, and people within culture differ from each other. There's a lot of problems, but it's not like I'm pretty confident in saying that culture is not genetic. So, yeah. Obviously, there are a lot of problems with this view. Like, just how do you categorize it in order to assess it? Like, culture is not sharply defined by categories, and culture is based on more than genetics. Culture is not that simple. Like, people can belong to multiple cultures, and it's also possible that personality can, although this last little comment here, you can have genetic effects. So personality is like half genetic. And so it could be that personality, the genetic part of personality influences culture, which means culture has a genetic component. But it's not like causing genetic piece. I'm happy to talk more about this, but I recognize that y'all probably want me to move on. So let's do that. So next time, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and new directions for cross-cultural research. Bye-bye!